Yeah.
Do you happen to know the status of PFAS testing in Massachusetts?
I don't. I suspect it's better than Vermont. I think of the surrounding states, we've done the least amount of testing. I know significantly less than New York. New York already has a PFAS advisory. I would guess that Massachusetts also has more resources than Vermont, but I'm not sure. Yeah.
Can I ask one more?
Yeah.
I was looking at, I guess it was TRI, the Toxics Release Inventory, and I was just pulling up, like I looked at Albany, New York, randomly, and I mean, I'm not a scientist, I may have misread this, but I'm pretty sure, I was just looking at the permits and what's being discharged into the water, and I'm used to seeing like suspected carcinogens being dumped into the water, but I'm pretty sure I thought it was formaldehyde, but I saw basically carcinogens being dumped into the water with valid permits from the government. Do you think I'm misreading that, or have you also seen things like that in the data?
My guess is probably not. So the Clean Water Act has kind of minimum thresholds that you have to be below. And so some amount of release is legal. So my guess is maybe, yeah. So that could be it. It could just be low enough levels that it's not triggering any kind of regulatory action.
Ma'am, I have a question.
Yeah.
Is it possible, is it true that I've heard that migratory birds in part is responsible for the stocking of some alpine lakes?
Oh, I love this question. This is a very old kind of tale or explanation. So a lot of people, actually, when I was up doing the survey research, I was staying at a campground and I had multiple people ask me this question. They heard that like their feet could transport fish eggs. I think this has largely been disproven. The primary way fish end up in lakes is people.
Thank you.
No problem. Yeah.
What's the effect of drought with the contaminants and the concentration?
That's a great question. I have not personally studied that, and I think it depends on the system a bit. But my guess is that it probably intensifies it. If you have less water, you have less surface area for the contaminants to spread out. And so the concentrations at the base of the food web are going to be higher. Not to mention other things like less water means warmer water, means higher metabolism of the animals, which means they're eating more, accumulating more. You also get lower oxygen levels, and when you have low oxygen levels, we tend to get higher methylation rates of mercury, so that's when basically carbon and hydrogen atoms bind to it and make it so that it can stick to our tissues. I think it probably makes things worse, at least thinking about mercury specifically. Yeah.
There's a negative situation in air travel, and there's an aircraft coming in with either landing gear issues. They put foam down on the runways. Is this the foam that the National Guard was, and what happens after that's been displaced onto the runway? Do they remove it? Is that allowed to run off?
It's a great question. I suspect it is the same foam. I don't know for sure. And my guess is, I'm seeing a confirmation that it's the same foam. In terms of cleanup, I'm not sure. I know the Burlington Airport, basically anything that ends up on the tarmac or at the Air Guard facility ends up in the municipal wastewater. We don't have a treatment facility at the airport, but the size of the airport might make a difference in terms of where it ends up. Yeah.
Or storm drain.
Or storm drain.
So it just goes directly. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
Is the practice of dumping fuels from landing aircraft still being practiced in the United States when approaching municipal airports?
Yes. I don't think it's very common, but my understanding is that still happens occasionally. and that it's usually a small amount, but yeah. No? Not good. Not from what you witnessed?
No.
From what I've heard is it's so volatile that it evaporates before the plane even lands. Yeah, no problem. Yeah.
So I don't fish, but I recently got into kayaking.
Mm-hmm.
Want to kayak in the Quabbin, and to do that, you have to have a fishing license. So
Interesting.
should I get a fishing license with the Quabbin, and one of these rainbow trout jumps on my hook? When I bring it home, what do I do? How do I know it's safe to eat?
Well, the first thing would be to look at the Massachusetts, I guess maybe Department of Health's website to see if they have a fish advisory posted. And it'll tell you if there's species that are higher risk than others. So rainbow trout may or may not be on that advisory, and it'll give you a recommendation of how much you can safely eat.
But there is no take-home kit you can just sort of test the fish?
Sadly, no.
That would be nice to know, right?
It would be nice. Yeah, no, it requires a chemistry lab. Yeah.
Could you do a water test?
That would also require a chemistry lab. In fact, it's maybe even harder to measure mercury in water because it's at such low levels compared to something like a fish. So you just need more sensitive methods to do it. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, it'd be nice if we could come up with something, right? We have the lead test kits. But as far as I know, nothing exists for mercury at the moment. Yeah.
I've given up fishing. There aren't any fish in the area. But I'm wondering about the fish meal that we're putting on our gardens. I know you're speaking mostly about freshwater.
Yes.
And I would imagine it's probably saltwater fish, but I'm wondering,
Yes.
saying if that's concentrated as well.
I don't think I've ever read any papers looking into that. But my educated guess would be it's marine fish that they're using. It's much cheaper to harvest large enough amounts of marine fish to mass produce something like fish meal. My guess it's also fish that are small, that we have less of a demand for people to eat them. Small fish tend to have fewer contaminants than big fish. Marine fish have fewer contaminants generally than freshwater fish of equal size. And so I would say the risk is on the lower end if I were to guess, but I wouldn't trust my word 100%.
So do freshwater fish have a higher concentration than saltwater?
It depends on the fish.
Yeah.
In oceans, you get fish that grow a lot bigger, like tuna, right? Tuna are a great example. We don't have fish generally that get that big in freshwater systems that people tend to eat. So if you were to take, like I said, a fish of equivalent size or trophic position from the ocean versus freshwater, the freshwater fish is probably going to have higher contaminants because it's just in a smaller system. So there's just more contaminants per volume of water than in the ocean. And then there's some other variables that influence it as well. But I will say I will eat certain marine fish, but I don't eat any freshwater fish. And PFAS is one of the big reasons they're just so ubiquitous in freshwater fish. Yeah.
You had intense flooding in the Winooski River.
Yeah, we did.
I don't know if you have any collections.
So Vermont's been hit with pretty severe flooding. The Winooski River, which is kind of the focus of this project, is one of those places. And so the question was how that's influenced contaminant levels or testing. I don't know. I don't think the state is testing so slowly to begin with, and the analysis takes a long time. It's expensive. And so I don't think even if we wanted to look at that, we'd have any information yet. Yeah, but it's definitely, it's mobilizing a lot of other types of contamination. Like people's propane tanks ended up in the cornfield behind my house. Actually, I thought about, I decided it was too grim, but the local newspaper in the town I live in has a picture of me rescuing playground equipment from my daughter's preschool on a stand-up paddleboard after one of the floods. So yeah, and we had concerns about letting the kids back on the playground after because of like bacteria contamination as well as oil-based contamination from lots of different.
Does PFAS sit, get washed into systems?
Yeah. The biggest concern with PFAS, I would say, is probably less so the flooding itself and more so if the flooding causes like an overflow of a wastewater treatment plant or something like that. Yeah.
Compared to mercury, with PFAS, is it like worse long-term health-wise or worse?
Oof. I guess it depends on how much mercury you get in your body. I've actually known a couple people to get mercury poisoning, and it's pretty bad. But if you maintain low enough levels, it's so hard to know because the impacts of a contaminant like PFAS are so potentially broad-reaching in terms of how it'll affect our health, and there's so many other things we're exposed to. It's really hard to kind of tease out thresholds of exposure and how they're going to influence our, susceptibility to cancer or other disease versus something else we might be exposed to. So I don't have a great answer for you, but I think we should be pretty concerned about PFAS. Less so for mercury. It's more of an issue if you have a lot all at once. PFAS, it's kind of a lifelong concern where you might not know that PFAS exposure is compromised your health until many years later. And even then, you might not know if your health issues are directly related. Yeah.
How did your aquatic mapping processes compare to other scientists and studies that have been done on aquatics?
Like the sonar mapping that I did? Oh, it was very low tech. Yeah, I would say most people are able to do it with like a boat with a motor and get really high quality data. But since I was doing it from an inflatable kayak and wind was a factor, I ended up having to kind of fill some data gaps with some modeling. But there are people out there who've made really cool models based on like surrounding topography of lakes that can kind of fill in what the shape of the lake probably is. So I use some of those models to fill in the gaps. So low quality compared to other scientists is my answer.
Great.
Yeah.
Follow up on the data you have in the Northwest. How receptive were the National Forest Service and National Park Service in missions around that sometimes in conflict? In your data, you're looking in the whole entire issue of like allowing certain lakes to just go back to their natural state and how they're maintained for all recreational purposes.
Yeah, I would say I worked a lot more closely with the national parks. They were really excited about the project. I worked really closely with the aquatic ecologist at one of the parks and would sometimes hike to the lakes with some of their field crews. And so they really wanted the data. The National Forest Service was like, yeah, great, do the project. And that was kind of it. So I don't know, we shared the results with them. I don't know how much they're gonna take it into account. I would say it depends on the National Forest. Some are much more proponents of continuing to stock, especially in Oregon, the National Forest there. But in Washington, I do think, they were kind of trending towards removal more so. So hopefully they use it. Yeah.
I love sea lamprey. I just think they're really cool and efficient. So I saw that. Is that anadromous fish? Are they like landlocked, or are they coming back and forth from the ocean? That's why I was wondering
Yeah.
And studying them, is it because they're naturalists and they're only in the river for a brief period of time, or are they stuck and, you know?
They're pretty landlocked in Lake
They are?
Champlain.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. There's actually debates among Western scientists of whether or not they're invasive in the lake, but there's Abenaki records of them, and they're a really important food source for the Abenaki people, so I feel very confident that they're not an invasive species. Yeah.
Well,
But-
they're native to Connecticut, and I just wasn't sure how they're.
Yeah, so before we put in dams and locks, Lake Champlain was well connected to the St. Lawrence River, which, you know, is connected to the ocean. And so we have a few different species. So Atlantic salmon, smelt, alewife, lamprey, all of them used to go between the ocean and Lake Champlain. Yeah. Yeah.
So I'll preface my question with, it seems you've done a lot of work in a short amount of time, in such a short amount of time. So my question is, what would, to you personally, be a potential recurring roadblock?
Ooh. Imposter syndrome. What would be a recurring roadblock for someone on this path? And I said imposter syndrome. So this is the phenomenon where you feel like you're an imposter and you shouldn't actually be doing what you're doing, or you're not qualified to be doing what you're doing. For me personally, I think that's gotten in the way quite a bit. And then I think I got really lucky in that some of my early experiences made it easier for me to get the next experience, right? Like I was pretty successful with getting funding. And I think that it snowballs. When you have success one time, it leads to more successes. And so if you're struggling to get funding kind of at the beginning of your career, it can be hard to overcome that.
So would you say that the growing expectation in your field adds to that kind of stress?
Yeah, so actually I transitioned from a research faculty position to a lecturer position, in part because I've got a 5-year-old daughter, and I don't want to spend my whole life doing only research and not putting my effort into other buckets of my life, and it just feels hard to keep up with what you need to do in order to get tenure and be successful.
You can't help others if you can't help yourself, right? So it's always good to kind of prioritize journey.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I did have one more PFAS question.
Yeah.
So, do you know, like, what groups or who might be looking at? So, obviously, it's in all these different products, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, some of them may have critical use, and some may be frivolous or unnecessary. I mean, are we starting to carve up, like, this is a frivolous, unnecessary use that, or are there alternatives that we could be substituting to that chemical that people are researching and plugging in as well?
Yeah, I think at this point we've come up with quite a few alternatives for a lot of different products. Like a lot of products that have like DWR coating tend not to have fluorinated compounds in them anymore, which typically are some form of PFAS. That said, who knows what the toxicity of those contaminants are. Our regulations don't really operate on the precautionary principle. We've had a somewhat recent update to the Toxic Substances Control Act that has led to the EPA being like, okay, we're going to evaluate some contaminants every year, but it's something like 20 or 40 a year, and we have thousands of new chemicals that get licensed every year. So, yeah, that was a wandering answer to that question. But I think a lot of people are trying to find alternatives. And I know with firefighting foam, most places have phased out the kinds with PFAS, but at the Air National Guard, they were still storing the PFAS-laden foam on site, even though they weren't using it anymore, and then it leaked. So, yeah, it's an uphill battle.
You can take another 2 questions.
Yeah.
And then invite people to come up.
I think that's a great idea. Yeah.
Just kind of along that subject, do you think California is more advanced with their regulations?
Mm-hmm.
the rest of
Yeah.
states.
I'm not super up to date on everything California's doing, but I do know that in general they have more people in positions advocating for better legislation. Like we've got Prop 65, which doesn't do all that much aside from scare people about the products they're using, or maybe make them, what's the word? Like less concerned because just everything has that warning on it. But I would say that more work is funded, more testing is done, but I'm less familiar with any PFAS regulations in California at the moment. Yeah. Desensitized is the word I was looking for there. All right, maybe come chat with me more if you want. And
Yeah, so
thank you all so much for your questions and for coming tonight.